Last weekend, the Smash community got to enjoy Let's Make Big Moves 2023, an insanely stacked tournament where every single set was best of 5. A great way to start the year. Top 8 was especially intense. Now I've analyzed the top 8 so that you don't have to. Let's get into it.
What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
Trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
So for every match in the top 8, I've done analysis, and based on that analysis, I've identified a theme for every set. Fair warning, this is my interpretation and it might not align with what the players were intending. This is a new format that I'm trying out. If you want to see more of these type of videos, let me know with a like or comment. If the reception is good, I'll do another one for Genesis in a few weeks. Without any further ado, let's start off with our first set. So for the first set, we look at the first round of losers of top 8 is going to be Sonix versus Riddles. So the theme of this set is speed, and I don't just mean like movement speed, I mean decision-making speed. Something that is really apparent about Riddles' play is that Riddles grinds a lot, and what that leads to is a very rapid pace of decision making. Now, ignoring the first game where Riddles went Kazuya and the matchup honestly looked a little bit subpar, Game 2, we see him switch to his Terry, who I think has a way better shot against Sonic, primarily because of the burst range of Crack Shoot. So what we see from Riddles is that he's constantly trying to leverage that burst range pressure from Crack Shoot to either interrupt Sonic using it or to wait for how Sonix plays around the Crack Shoot burst range and counter that. However, that waiting aspect is a little bit underdeveloped in Riddles' play because his focus has been on playing faster and faster and faster. And that speed of decision making allows him to overwhelm a lot of opponents, even an opponent like MK Leo, who we have seen Riddles beat before. So the essence of this fast decision making is that you're trying to establish as many problems as possible for the opponents. By establishing a lot of problems, your opponent has to react to what you're putting down on the table, which allows you to control the game, control the information, and in general, if your opponent makes a mistake in his positioning, his reactions, or his execution, or if he lacks knowledge on certain topics, those are all very easily abused by your fast decision making. That said, in this situation, we found a bit of a downfall for that faster decision making. So on one hand, we have Riddles, who practices a lot and increases the speed of his play continuously. On the other hand, Sonix, also very much a grinder, right? Sonic practices constantly, and because of that, Sonix also has increased the speed of his play as of late. And what we see is that Sonix is practiced enough to keep up with Riddles' speed, and when the speed is no longer an advantage, we kind of get back to the core RPS in this game, which is about quality, right? Whereas Riddles normally relies, or I should say leverages, his decision-making speed to overwhelm his opponents and outplay them by making more decisions, which the opponent might not always be ready for. In this situation, he's not making more decisions than Sonix. So he's not overwhelming Sonix by decision-making speed. So how do you beat someone who's at the same speed of decision-making as you? Well, that's where we get into the quality of decisions. So if you look at a player like Leo, for example, he might not be as fast as Riddles, but the average quality of his decisions is larger, right? Because he takes a little bit more time for his decisions, and a little bit of extra time allows him to react a little bit later, which gives him a little bit more information, or it lets him think or reconsider his options a little bit more, right? So oftentimes this speed is at the cost of quality. Now, this is not always the case, right? Because ideally, your quality continuously increases as your speed increases. That's just a matter of practice, right? Like someone who is low level might make, let's say, 50 decisions a minute at like a low level, but someone at high level can make like 90 decisions a minute at a high level, right? So we're basically looking at how practice these players are, both in terms of quality and speed. And in this situation, when the speed is equal, it all comes down to quality. And I think Sonix here has two things in his favor. So one, it looks like he came into this matchup with some insane preparation on Riddles' patterns. We see him constantly interrupting Riddles' speed of decision making and being very ready for what Riddles could put on the table. On top of that, Sonic's advantage state in this set was impeccable, even forcing Riddles to switch off the Terry to Roy because of the advantage state decision making from Sonix. And the second advantage that we find here is the matchup. I think when it comes to a battle of speed, Sonix almost always wins because of Sonic his own properties. Sonic as a character inherently asks you to provide high quality decisions. The higher the quality of the decisions, the better. However, you also need to keep up the speed, because if you don't play quickly, Sonic's own speed will overwhelm you. So this balance needs to be very, very accurate. However, I personally believe that you can bias your decisions towards quality, because Sonic doesn't have amazing rushdown, right? Like Sonic might get in and mix you up with burst range, which can be a rising fair, a dash attack, a dash grab, anything like that, even side Bs or down Bs that are released early. However, it's not like a Fox where he gets in with Nair and then gets further mix-ups that are hard to deal with. So when you position correctly, the actual decision making in terms of what button you press afterwards is a little bit more lenient against Sonic. And I feel like a critical adaptation for Riddles here would be to slow his pace down and focus a little bit more on a lower tempo of decision making, where the quality of his decisions are higher. Overall, an amazing win by Sonix, beating Riddles, Kazuya, Terry, and then the Roy. The Roy, of course, also trying to use that fast decision making. However, Riddles' relative lack of practice on the Roy means that the quality of decisions suffer a little bit more, and that is where the Roy goes down. Before we get into the next set, I want to quickly remind everyone that I'm doing a coaching discount for the entire month of January. By using code 2023SWEEP, you'll be getting 10% off both on my site and on Metafy. Details in the description below. Moving into the winners side of the bracket, we got Spargo versus Glutonny. Now, this set also was a matter of speed. Both these characters, fast character, right? Glutonny having a lot of options in the air, Spargo with limit especially, a speed demon. And what this leads to is a dynamic of reversals, and I think that really was the theme of this set. It was reversals. So Spargo and Gluto both, by playing fast, focus more on coverage heavy gameplay, right? Covering options, because when you're playing fast, you're putting as many problems on the table as you can, making your opponent deal with your problems. However, when you are focusing on putting problems on the table, that also means that you're opening yourself up more to reversals, because when you are establishing that problem, if your opponent guesses correctly, they can get past it. Whereas if you are reacting to the opponent, you often get to react to these reversals and capitalize off of them. So there's been a huge dynamic in this set of balancing that fast gameplay, especially from Spargo's side, who has very aptly analyzed that he has the advantage in this matchup, right? If they both pose problems, who's going to win? It's going to be the man with the sword, especially when Spargo pilots the character. So in this situation, Spargo focuses on that speed to cover options aggressively, and Glutonny tries to weave around them. However, there are these moments in which Spargo suddenly switches to reaction, and from that counters Gluto's reversal. The opposite is also true. Even when in a bad situation, Spargo will repeatedly try to play RPS. When he's in a bad spot, he will repeatedly try to establish problems. Glutonny, a little bit more reactive in this situation, is very willing to counter these reversals. However, the thing is, if one reversal comes through, that is a huge swing. Cloud really suffers off stage in this matchup. And likewise, Wario really suffers in the corner in this matchup. So both these characters would love to get a reversal. So you see both of them fishing and really looking for those reversals. And I think the dynamics are just huge. And what you find is that throughout the set, this balance between establishing problems and reacting to reversals shifts more and more into the reaction territory as conditioning continues. And a huge aspect of this is center stage control. So what you'll find is that initially both players are very willing to commit their stage positioning to get these reads, right? To get these problems out there. But as the set progresses, they focus more on covering the center and allowing their opponent to get out of nasty situations, but at the cost of still being put in the corner. So another interesting dynamic to keep in mind in this battle for the reversals is that it's a mix-up, right? You don't just reversal to center. There's a reversal to center with an aerial, there's a reversal to center with an air dodge, but there's also just the fact that you can feint going to the center and then instead going to the corner without being contested going to the corner, right? So yes, you are now stuck in the corner, but you didn't get contested on the way there, which is also a huge boon. So a lot of what you can find in this set, if you're willing to rewatch it, is how how they get out of disadvantage. Both of these characters with their limitations, right? Cloud has the sword, but struggles a lot when he's wrong, whereas Wario has a little bit more leeway, but doesn't really have the tools to brute force his way through. And the dynamic between these two characters is just electric. An important learning from this set is that tempo is a choice. It's a mix-up, right? So you're not always playing fast. You're not always playing slow. Being able to adjust the speed at which you play based on what the opponent's putting on the table is just as important as adjusting your options based on what the opponent puts on the table. In other words, the more of a mix-up you can identify, right? The more of a choice you can make, the more control you have over the game. And this is an aspect of control related to gameplay speed, but also disadvantage and stage control that is very, very critical in the current meta. Moving to the other side of winner semis, we got Tweek versus Leo. Definitely one of the most anticipated matches of the tournament. Tweek taking the 2nd seed over Leo, who was the 3rd seed for the tournament, and it was Diddy versus Joker this time, whereas we've seen the Leo byleft last couple of encounters. And Tweek won 3-1. So a very, very strong showing by Tweek. And the theme of this set was definitely flexibility. Now, why flexibility? I think the best place to start is Tweek Talks. I posted a tip regarding something that Tweek was discussing about win conditions. And Tweek was saying, like, so many things in this game are essentially coin flips. And what I was talking about in that tweet is that what Tweek identifies as coin flips are often related to win conditions. So I think there are 2 types of characters in this game. And this is an oversimplification, but an interesting one. And the types are characters with flexible win conditions and characters with severe win conditions. And an example of a severe win condition would be like Kazuya, right? Like he wins by using electric, but electric is very strong. Cloud would be another example of a severe win condition. He wins with back air, but his back air is really strong. Now, the other tools surrounding these win conditions are often weaker, right? Kazuya does have grabs, but he doesn't have them in a way that really dominates games. And the same goes for Cloud, right? Like Cloud's ground game is subpar, Cloud's grab game is subpar. So these characters sacrifice things for their severe win conditions. Now, both these characters, Joker and Diddy, are both very flexible characters. Now, Joker is a little bit different because Arsene gives him a little bit more of a severe win condition. Diddy is also different because Banana does the same thing. And that creates a very interesting dynamic in this matchup where the process of the Rebels gauge bar or the existence of Banana and the state in which it exists, right? Whether it's on the ground or in Diddy's hand or in Joker's hand, it really changes how you play this matchup. If the win condition is severe, then you have to really respect that win condition. Whereas if the win condition is flexible, it is more about what the opponent is doing and changing your playstyle to counter them. So what we saw in this set was a constant war of counters that are kind of like broken up by this moment of a very severe win condition being on the table. So it starts off with these 2 characters that aren't very severe, right? Like Diddy has ground game with down tilt, burst range with forward air and dash attack. He has landing areas that are good. He has good out of shield. He has good grab game. He kind of has everything, right? He has monkey flip. Joker, on the other hand, very similar, right? Gun is unreactable chip that is almost full screen. He has burst range. He has an amazing grab game. He has rising aerials to wall you out. He has interception. He has amazing whiff punishes. He has the cam game. Basically, both these characters have a lot of different ways to approach the neutral. And what we found is that Diddy is so adept at using these various strategies interchangeably, or I should say Tweek is so adept at using these strategies interchangeably that it became hard for Leo to keep up. And again, we kind of go back to this theme of presenting problems. And it felt like Diddy in this neutral presents a little bit more problems than Joker does, which is why I think a lot of people consider this a losing matchup for Joker. Now, what happens though is that Leo doesn't mind losing out on neutral too much. If he does, like, let's say 50% and then gets Arsene because he's at, like, let's say 80, then that is a good situation for Joker, right? You take Diddy to 40, 50, you hit him like with a down throw back air, and now he's in a situation where he might have to guess for game. Diddy disadvantage obviously is really strong, so this didn't happen very often, plus the pressure of tournament makes it a little bit harder to commit to things like that, but this dynamic is all right. The question then becomes, can Leo leverage the severity of Arsene enough to get the win, or will Tweek survive the onslaught and afterwards basically clean it up. Because of the consistency of Diddy's skill power, it can be hard for Joker to find a second Arsene in his stock. He would kind of have to get a Rebel's Guard read, which then opens him up to a lot more swinginess as well. So what we discovered in this set is that Tweek was extremely good at mitigating Arsene's potency, partially with the use of banana, because again, right, like Arsene might put a very severe win condition on the board, so does banana. So what we really saw in this matchup was why this matchup was rough for Joker, but also how Tweek used a variety of win conditions to overwhelm the opponent rather than relying on a singular strategy and kind of like basing his play off of the threat of a very, very strong linear game plan. Leo, on the other hand, tried to fight back, but even though Leo is also very, very potent at that varied game style, I feel like Tweek is definitely way more practiced in it. Leo kind of like focusing his efforts on characters like Marth and Byleth, who are a little bit more linear than Joker is, right? Both these characters, especially Byleth, very potent at like a very specific range, doing a very specific thing. In this situation of Byleth, it is at mid-range walling. And you can see when Leo plays Byleth, he bases all his decisions off of the power of that mid-range walling. Tweek, on the other hand, very practiced at the variety that Diddy introduces and understands that within this variety, he can keep up with Joker while also within that system of variety having stronger baseline options, and that really drove the win home for Tweek. Amazing performance by Tweek, and really solidifying that, hey, the Diddy is a meta threat, and that Joker in a lot of ways is not yet adapted to the meta. I do feel like the potential is there, and I think Leo can definitely do it, but he has to go back to the drawing board and figure out how Joker functions in this meta. One thing to keep in mind when both players don't have a very severe win condition, interactions become a lot more rare, right? So Cloud starts his interactions because of the threat of Becker. Kazuya starts his interactions because of the threat of Electric. Because both these characters don't really have a severe option like that is readily available, oftentimes games become a lot slower, which is what we saw. And within that slower game pace, Diddy thrives because that slower game pace allows him to get his bananas. And on top of that, yes, Arsene makes Joker stronger, but it doesn't make his approaches better per se, which again gives Diddy a lot more time. And we saw a lot of Arsenes in which Leo was just kind of forced to camp back at Diddy, forced to play it slow because he doesn't have a severe enough win condition to force on Diddy and really force the issue. And Tweek really thrives in that slower paced environment because it allows him to identify what win conditions he should thrive for. Amazing performance by both players at Let's Make Big Moves. Moving back into losers, we got Leo versus Light, another Leo Joker set. And oh my God, I want to talk about this because I am the biggest Light fanboy, especially as of late. His play has been immaculate. And this set shows a huge meta trend that I think is extremely important, and it is beating shields without grabbing. And guess who is amazing at beating shields without grabbing? It is Light. So in this set, we see Leo relying on shield a lot, partially because when he played Joker a lot, shielding was a huge part of the meta. It still is, and Joker's shield is amazing, right? A lot of people don't like Joker's shield, but let's not forget, Joker has some of the best grab game. He has an amazing role, arguably the best forward role in the game to get out of bad spots, and arguably the best full hop out of shield in the game as well. So Leo is very adept at using shields to reversal situations, right? So you pressure his shield, he uses that time to jump out of shield, and it kind of functions like a spot dodge, right? Where normally Leo, if you're spot dodging, you're dodging an attack and then you can spot dodge cancel into an attack of your own. It's the same dynamic. You jump over an attack and then you come down with your own attack in this example. And this is partially due to Joker's full hop statistics, but mostly because he has the fastest fast fall in the game, accelerating his speed by 90 instead of 60%. So Leo relying on that shield to mitigate a lot of Fox's pressure because Fox's pressure is hard to whiff punish. Light does not want to grab the shield. Why? Because then you are feeding into what makes shield so good. And this is where the meta developments come in. Light uses various tactics to beat Leo shielding. The most important of all is using shield damage. And this is an important aspect of Leo's gameplay. So the way Leo plays is that he keeps his options very basic in the sense that he is not really focusing on too much advanced new tech. Think about something like footstool out of shield, or even something like using parry, something which Light really likes. Leo keeps it simple, keeps his techniques relatively uncomplicated. The most complex new addition to his gameplay was Slingshot, and even Slingshot is mostly a movement tool, right? Whereas something like Footstool does require a bit of deliberate thought to identify spacing, move safeties, and more. So in this situation, Leo not really reliant on a tool like parry because he wants to keep the intake of information clean, right? Because if you're focused on parrying, that means that your focus is on a specific interaction, which means that you're more vulnerable to other interactions. So for example, when you're focusing on parry, someone can come in with a fox down air and interrupt your defense. So Leo trying to keep his information intake clean to be able to react more easily. And Light makes use of that by saying, well, if you're not going to call out my offense, that means that my average offense is stronger. And then he uses that extra room that Leo is giving him to instead set up these back airs, which eventually even lead to a shield poke that kills Leo. Some other tools that Light uses is just timing mix-ups, right? Fox has a very fast fastfall as well. Because fastfall is a multiplication of your base fastfall speed, Fox also gets a significant increase in fastfall. So we see him do fastfall or non-fastfall down airs, which both have different timings to open Leo up repeatedly, as well as mixing up things like empty lands and forcing Leo to aggress by using defensive lasers and kind of like chipping away at Leo, saying, well, you're gonna have to approach me sometimes. And when Leo is aggressing, of course, he is less reliant on shield, thus mitigating a huge weakness that Fox has, which is that his grab ward is not amazing, and he can kind of struggle to beat people who are shield camping. Light having a lot of counters ready here, and again, I feel like there's a lot of counterplay on Leo's side that is available, but in this situation, Leo not leaning into that, more focusing on what he is most familiar with. That said, the Joker proved to be too much for Light as Leo closes out the win. Leo with some amazing capitalization on Arsene, and something that we really notice is that once that Arsene is on deck, Leo is ready to pose these problems, is ready to establish the pace of the match, and when he does get those hits, and my boy does he get them, he capitalizes beautifully and ends Light's stock at absurd percentages, even as low as 50. Moving to the other sides of losers quarters, we have Glutonny versus Sonix, and the reason I took this one second is because I want to combine this one with loser semifinals, which was Sonix versus Leo. And both these sets had a very similar theme, which is don't play losing matchups. Now, I want to be very clear. I think Sonix is an amazing player, and I'm not saying that Sonix would have lost if these matchups were even or, losing for Sonix. I think Sonix could have beaten both of these players, even playing a losing matchup. In this case, though, the significance of a losing matchup was very clearly found. If we looked at Sonic's Glutonny, we saw that Wario really struggled to even approach Sonic. And if we looked at Leo Sonic's, a very similar dynamic happened where what we talked about before, right? Arsene doesn't really improve Joker's approach options, and that means that Sonic is very potent at mitigating the threat of Arsene. So instead of going into bad matchups and not playing them, instead I want to talk a little bit about identifying bad matchups and things that you can do to mitigate them. So oftentimes what you find is that when a matchup is bad, that often comes down to the fact that your win condition is severely hampered by the opponent's tools, or a weakness that you have is capitalized on easily by the opponent's tools. So in this situation, a huge weakness for Wario is that Wario struggles to approach. Once he gets in, he gets his combos, his advantage state is insane, and he can repeatedly try to get in because generally his disadvantage is powerful enough. The issue with Sonic is that Sonic isn't really the type of character to kill you for disadvantage once. Of course, he can do it just like any other character in this game, but Sonic can win by just slowly chipping away at you. So that strength that Wario has of having a good disadvantage is less significant against a character like Sonic. And that weakness that Wario has, in this case, being unable to approach easily, is abused by Sonic beautifully. And we see a similar thing with Joker, right? Like one of the strengths of Joker is that his disadvantage is good. He recovers very well. If he's in a juggle, he has an amazing fastball. He has down guns as well. He can get out of the corner easily with his roll, his down tilt, and again, his good jumps. All these things are less important against Sonix. And Sonix, again, huge credit to him. He capitalized on these weaknesses beautifully, and he mitigated the strengths beautifully as well. So what you can do in the future to compensate for these bad matchups is that you can try to identify secondary win conditions. So if your opponent's problems, in other words, the issues that they put on the table, if they beat the issues that you prefer to put on the table by default, right? So if you think again about something like, Sonic, the issue he puts on the table is that he's hard to approach, and the issue that Wario puts on the table is that when he gets in, he destroys you. As you can see, Sonic kind of like naturally matches up well against this. What you want to do is you want to identify an alternative win condition. So how do you capitalize maybe on a weakness that Sonic has that you can capitalize on well as Wario, or maybe in general? So if you think about a weakness that Sonic has, is that Sonic's neutral is reliant on putting himself in minor disadvantageous situations given his play patterns, right? So there are multiple play patterns to Sonic, so this is not like universally applicable, but a very common play pattern we see from Sonic is the side B anti-approaching. And after the side B, oftentimes Sonic will have to somehow compensate for the situation he puts himself in. So what you find is that Sonic will do side B, stop on your shield. That's a mix-up. Side B, jump afterwards. That's a standard, right? But then he's in the air. What does he do after he's in the air? How does he get back to the ground? And that is where you want to fight Sonic. However, how do you consistently do that with Wario? That is stuff that you have to figure out. That's stuff that you have to figure out for your own character. Similarly, if we look at like a matchup that is seen as bad for Sonic, we look at, for example, Sonic Samus. Samus can mitigate the entire side B dynamic because of charge shot, right? And not entirely, but for a lot of reasons. So what does Sonic do? Sonic stops relying on the issue that Sonic wants to present and instead focuses on counterplaying Samus specifically. So what is a weakness for Samus? A weakness for Samus is that her mid-range is relatively committal, right? The way she controls mid-range with dash attack, grab, forward air, run up air, all of these options are relatively committal. And even when she releases charge shot, that means that there's a timer during which her charge shot needs to be, charged up again. Otherwise it can get clanked out relatively easily. It is not as big of a hitbox, which means it doesn't anti-air as well, etc., which opens up a bit of a weakness. So what Sonic starts doing, and we saw this against Quick, is he starts using ground movement to bait out these commitments from Samus and then punishes them. Is this what Sonic loves doing? Not at all. But in this situation, Sonic has identified an alternative win condition and pushed it until he got the win. Now, I'll be real, at most levels, these bad matchups don't really matter. And let's not forget, this is not like a minus 0.5. Like, I think Sonic has a very sizable advantage against both Wario and Joker. That said, at this top level, playing a bad matchup like this, it just handicaps you too much, especially against a character like Sonic. And this is another dynamic in bad matchups that you have to keep in mind. Again, there are two types of characters, right? There's flexible characters and there's severe characters. And if there's a severe character in your path and their severe win condition naturally counters your character, that will be a really good moment to switch. And I think Sonic's win condition is quite severe. It dominates the match once it is activated, right? Once he has that lead and he gets to set up the spin dash, it is very hard to deal with. You are constantly playing around the threat of it and the existence of it. So if your character is either severe or flexible and it gets naturally countered by that severe win condition of Sonic, that is a good moment to counter. And the opposite is also true, right? So Samus charge shot, again, a very severe win condition. And because it counters Sonic naturally, that would be a good moment to counterpick. In this situation, Sonic is flexible enough that his other win conditions are powerful enough to still win. So that's, like a point in favor of Sonic as a character, but not every character has that. So really try to experiment and find out if these alternative win conditions are worth pursuing. And if not, that would be a good moment to look into maybe a secondary to improve your chances of winning. Again, mostly applies to top level gameplay. Moving into winners finals, the rematch of the rematch of the rematch of the rematch. It is Tweek versus Spargo. And the first thing that stood out to me in this set, it immediately just stood out like a sore thumb. It is the difference in Tweek's playstyle. Tweek, normally a slow-paced player, very methodical, tries something new against Spargo, and that is the theme of this set. It is that losses only matter if you don't adapt. And I think what we saw from Tweek in this set is that his adaptation is world class. And again, I want to talk about adaptation on two layers. So the first one that stood out to me, like I said, is the speed. Tweek is playing faster and faster and faster to keep up with Spargo's speed. If you want to talk about fast players in the world right now, we talked about Riddles being extremely fast. I think Light is another player that's very fast, and Spargo, those three really on the apex of decision-making speed in the Smash world right now. And Tweek leveling up his speed, trying to practice that to keep up with Spargo, and it works out beautifully, especially the first 3 games. Yes, he loses some here and there, But what we do see is that he does slow down over the course of the set, especially in game 4. We see him rely on a little bit more of a comfortable, slow pace style, pays the price, but then within that system of a slow-paced playstyle, he relies on his comfort, right? He starts leaning more into his comfort, and within that comfort of slower, higher quality decisions, he finds some reads on Spargo. So what we see is that the whole is more than the sum of his parts, right? So these tempo adaptations that Tweek is putting out here are allowing him to keep up with Spargo. And during that high tempo gameplay, he gets these reads, and then when he has the reads, he switches back to what he's used to, leverages these reads, and wins out game 5. So the adaptation is both on a strategical level in between sets, but also on a interaction level within the set itself. And I think what you can learn from this is that there's always a way to adapt on multiple layers. And the layers that I often define in my coaching are that there's interaction-based adaptation, right? Which is basically saying, okay, well, they're doing a roll or they're doing a spot dodge, right? So like either I can read the roll or read the spot dodge. It's very much like the individual interaction. You can extrapolate that to the situation. So you can say, well, in this situation, they roll or spot dodge, but if I change the situation, then I might get a better mix-up out of it, right? So you can say, well, instead of trying to solve this interaction, I'm going to change the situation entirely to change the level at which I adapt. And then you can extrapolate a situation to a set of situations, which then forms its strategy, right? So we have interaction, situations, and then strategy. So strategy is how you try to weave your situations together. So if you are an aggressive player, then you look for situations in which your opponent has to play around your options that take away their stage control, right? So aggression is about moving forward. It's about taking away stage control. Whereas a defensive player might be focusing more on defending the stage they already have. So they take situations where the opponent is coming towards them. So as you can see, the interactions lead into the situations, and the situations leads into a strategy. And then at the level above that, there's like the meta of strategies. So in other words, how do you use strategies to counter strategies? So you can say, well, this is my strategy, I play aggressive, but you can also say, well, my aggression in and of itself is not working, right? So like light will often solve issues within the realm of a aggressive strategy. He will either rush you down or feint or mix up between his rush down options. But you can also say, I can solve this problem by changing my strategy. I can say I can be more defensive. I can be faster or slower. And that's like the meta of strategies. And then the final layer, the ultimate layer, is the psychology, which is basically saying, well, all of that doesn't matter if I know what you're going to do. And we saw Tweek not focusing on solving the interactions, because that is that coin flip that Tweek talked about before, right? Like it's either entirely right or entirely wrong. That's what an interaction is RPS. He looks at situations and he says, well, again, a little bit too low level, right? Like you don't have control over situations at all times, especially when Spargo is making decisions so quickly. So instead he says, well, instead of looking at how I optimize situations, I look at how I weave my situations together. I fix my strategy. And then later on in the set, he switches to a slower game pace to counter what he found, right? So he also changes on a meta level. And of course, the psychological adaptations are everywhere. And something that plays into this is that the comfort that he finds in the slower playstyle, that is a psychological aspect to his decision making. So maybe playing slower wasn't objectively the best choice, right? If we look at like objective like outcome here, keeping up with Spargo's speed might have been the best decision, but psychologically, Tweek said, I am better off playing slower, and it paid off for him. So we really see Tweek considering the ranges of or the layers of adaptations, the depth to which you can go when adapting to the opponent. Spargo, obviously an insane player, and really excited to look into grand finals. But first, we're going to be moving on into losers finals. So losers finals, Spargo versus Sonix. Sonix making an insane losers run to get here, and Spargo trying to get his revenge on Tweek, and Spargo opting for Aegis from the get-go. And I think that leads into the theme for this set, which is that movement creates situations. And I think what we really see from Spargo here is that he uses Aegis, or specifically Mithra's amazing mobility, to make Sonix believe he is engaging in interactions that don't really exist. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is very straightforward. If you show your opponent a specific situation. It takes a while for your opponent to react to the situation and then act on it, right? And reaction time plus input delay is generally about 20 frames. We'll add a little bit of move startup and maybe a little bit of movement to that. And generally you'll be playing about 30 seconds behind. Not always, of course, but in a lot of these neutral situations, that kind of just about turns out to be the case. So what we see Spargo do is Spargo shows Sonic a specific situation, and then as Sonic goes to capitalize on it, Spargo changes the situation to something else, making Sonic's his capitalization incorrect. And that is what makes Aegis so scary for Sonic, because Aegis' situation changes are very potent because of the threat of her burst range, as well as the multifaceted nature of her neutral. So for example, Mithra, when she jumps in, she has her Nair, which is a mix-up in and of itself. She has an amazing fastfall, which goes into amazing tilts and an amazing grab, right? So that entire sequence is just extremely rich in depth of options. Her ground game, very similar, right? The dash attack is just an overwhelming tool that makes it hard for Sonic to even start up side B. So if Spargo enters a situation in which he could interrupt side B, then Sonic's engaging in that is already a bit of a hard sell. And then on top of that, Spargo uses the threat of these options to then further change situations. So he creates a situation comes with a threat, and then that threat allows him to create more situations. So what you find is that, again, both of these players are playing extremely fast. Spargo out of comfort, right? As I said, one of the fastest players in the world, and Sonic's, in my experience, and this is my interpretation, trying to keep up with Spargo. And what we saw is that Spargo wins in this battle of speed, but Sonic's kept it well, right? He took a game and kept it very competitive. And the reason for that is because he is doing what Spargo is doing. So when Spargo creates a situation in which he's strong, he hasn't yet won the neutral. He needs to capitalize on it. So Sonic's on the side of playing around the issues that Spargo puts on the table. Sonix will make himself look weak and then use that to bait Spargo to engage, saying like, oh, Spargo, you got a strong situation, I need to play around you. And then instead using that confidence to make Spargo engage and then counter Spargo's engagements. We see this a lot with Sonix jumping over Spargo, for example, or rudely setting up spin dashes in situations he shouldn't. So both of these players really trying to feel each other out by creating situations and implying the threat that comes with them, and then basically entering a game of chicken where the person who commits poorly loses. But if you never commit, then you're giving a lot of control to the opponent. So eventually you do have to commit to limit the opponent's options. So what we really see as a core to this dynamic is essentially the question of who establishes bigger problems, right? And what do you do if the opponent establishes bigger problems than you? And so far, Sonic has engaged in matchups where he presents the biggest problem. And I feel like what really made Spargo eke out the win here is the fact that Aegis establishes bigger problems than Sonix does. However, I do want to give it up to Sonix because he has been playing this entire tournament with an insanely patient style, with a very methodical and diligent decision-making pattern. And oftentimes these games take like 5-6 minutes, and he's been playing set after set against world-class opponents, winning, beating all of them, and getting all the way to losers finals, even taking a game off of Spargo, and again, keeping it very competitive all the way through. So his stamina is insane. So if there's something you want to learn outside of the fact that, you know, how this movement and this implied threat creates situations, I would say that the importance of stamina cannot be understated. I think Sonix's stamina to be able to play this way for this long is insane, and definitely a sign of how much he practices and how much he loves this game. And I think his gameplay was just nothing short of amazing. I know people are not a big fan of Sonic, but I cannot undersell Sonix's potency. So for Tweek versus Spargo, the grand finals set, the one in which Tweek solidifies his win with a 3-2 victory, I really want to highlight this as a cautionary tale. So this video, as you may have noticed, has been a lot about the pace of play, partially because it's something that I've been looking into myself recently. Huge shout outs to Tony. His Twitter will be in the description for talking to me about this topic and brainstorming some of the ways that it applies to Smash. He's obviously an amazing coach. The reason we talk about this so much is because some of the fastest players are present in this top 8. We have Riddles, we have Light, and we have Spargo. And then of course we have a Sonic player here as well. And then there's Gluto, right, with the airspeed. Really, the odd ones out here are Tweek and Leo, who are both adapting to this faster playstyle to various degrees of success. And I think the reason why I want to highlight the grand finals as a cautionary tale is because we see the downfall of the fast playstyle that Spargo establishes. Because the reason why fast gameplay works is because you are in control of the information. You're in control of a lot of the interactions, right? You're constantly putting out problems and then seeing how the opponent reacts to the problems. And yes, that means that you get hit sometimes, but it also means that you're controlling afterwards. And if you don't have the awareness to adapt immediately, that is where things can go wrong. And what we see from Spargo in this set is that he starts dying for these callouts a little bit too much, right? Like whiffing an LCS on a normal getup, whiffing a dash attack on a normal getup, and getting punished for it. We even saw this against Sonix, where he was calling out Sonix spin dash with Mithra side B, whiffing and dying extremely early in a matchup where you don't want to be. And who am I to say that these options are bad, right? Because I think Spargo uses that side B because it worked before, right? He's capitalizing on his information he gained, but the risk reward is still subpar. And I think that is the hard thing about this fast playstyle, is that you're constantly tracking a lot of information and you have to measure very precise aspects of decision making, like risk reward, in the blink of an eye. And Spargo, in this grand final situation, I feel like this is where the stamina kind of gets reduced, and this is why we see Tweek not really playing as fast as he was in Winners Finals, maybe carrying over some of those adaptations that we talked about in the latter half of Winners Finals into Grand Finals. But we see that Tweek possibly also realizing that his stamina is running a little bit lower and he cannot really keep up with that game pace, and instead relying on that comfort again. And Spargo instead pushing for that speed, and that to me was the end of Spargo in this tournament. So in conclusion, I personally don't like this meta trend. I think faster gameplay is, like I said, it comes at the cost of quality. And ideally, as our players get better, they can play better at a higher quality. So in that sense, Spargo can only get better and better, right? But there's two ways to approach it. You can see Tweek, who's playing a slower game style and basically slowly ramping up the speed until he gets faster. Whereas Spargo is kind of like, I'm going to go fast and I'm going to make my decision making keep up with that. On top of that, Spargo also reaching second place with that playstyle. So who am I to knock it, right? Like, I'm not talking about the effectiveness of the playstyle. I just feel like it is less scalable to play that fast. That said, human limitation is a funny thing, and I think a lot of people have been wrong about what humans can do. And I do think faster and accurate decision making is very much possible within the limits of this game. That said, if we look at arguably the most successful meta in the world right now, which is Japan, they do opt for a bit of a slower decision making style. In reality, I think both styles have their place, right? Like going a little bit slower for higher quality, going a little bit faster at the cost of quality. They're both valid. And at the end of the day, what you want is you want to be able to reach into your tool bag and pick the option that fits the situation. And if I were to give Spargo any sort of advice in this situation, I would say being able to do both would push him to be just that much stronger. Meanwhile, Tweek, I think he's really shown his growth in his performance here today. Overall, I'm super excited to see where the meta will go, because this faster gameplay really has a potency to really push the meta further, right? As we see people approach these faster paces of decision making, I definitely feel like there's room for improvement to get higher quality decisions. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a game of chicken, right? Let's say 100 decisions per minute, that is your max. Then how close are you willing to get to that decision making speed in tournament? Are you going to play it safe and get closer to 90? Or are you going to fly close to the sun at 99 and maybe go over? And when you're over, that's where the decision-making quality really drops. Of course, there are other elements to the meta right now, but I think it was a theme that really fit the Let's Make Big Moves top 8. We saw Riddles get shut down for his game speed. We saw Leo adapting to faster game speeds as well as Tweek. We saw Spargo really establish dominance through his gameplay, through that repeated act of putting problems out there and making the opponent deal with it. The reality of the matter is that in Ultimate, a lot of things are not reactable or barely reactable. And if they're not reactable, then putting a problem out there can be done freely. And if things are barely reactable, then the opponent needs to anticipate something, which then creates an opening in the future. I think there's a lot of spectrums on which Smash resides, right? There's the movement spectrum, right? So stage control is an omnipresent theme in these games. The interactions and the RPS and the psychology behind it is an omnipresent theme behind these games. And the temporal dimension, right? The time aspect is just one of these axes that you can view the game through. And I think there are way more interpretations of Let's Make Big Moves Top 8. This is just one of them. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to support the channel, and I'll see you all next time. Stay smart.